Welcome to the mysterious casebook, where hidden truths wait to be uncovered. Tonight, we follow Miss Marple into a chilling puzzle. The masquerade of the missing signature. A vanished name, a night of masks, and secrets no guest dares confess. Are you listening late at night or during your morning tea? Share with us below. Now, pour yourself something warm, and let the mystery begin. The flutter of envelopes upon polished hall tables was the first sign that something unusual was stirring in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. Ordinarily, the morning post consisted of bills, circulars, and the occasional letter from a distant cousin. Yet this morning, each envelope bore the same distinctive handwriting, a flourish of loops and strokes that suggested an organizer with a taste for drama and a deliberate desire to impress. By mid-morning, Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall had telephoned her neighbor, Miss Marple, to remark that she too had received one. It was, she explained with breathless delight, an invitation to a masquerade ball to be held in the village assembly rooms. The very notion seemed almost absurd in such a place, yet undeniably enticing. For a village accustomed to jumble sales, whist drives, and the occasional garden fete, the idea of a masquerade was thrilling. At the post office, Mrs. Petherick, sorting her parcels with an air of exaggerated importance, whispered that she had never in all her days known St. Mary Mead to aspire to such grandeur. By 11s, the postmistress, Miss Hartnell, had already speculated on who might appear in Venetian masks, and Mrs. Price Ridley confided to anyone who would listen that such frivolity was bound to end in scandal. Masks, she intoned darkly, invite all manner of misconduct. Her pronouncement only fueled the gossip further, for nothing delighted the villagers more than the possibility of impropriety behind a painted mask. Costumes, it seemed, had been ordered from a theatrical company in London. The vicar's wife, fluttering with both anxiety and excitement, reported to the Women's Institute that even she had sent away for a gown of brocade, though she hastened to assure them it was quite modest and in keeping with her station. Meanwhile, the younger set were beside themselves with anticipation. Leonard Clement, the vicar's nephew, declared he would attend as a cavalier, while young Millicent Bantry planned something in the style of a Grecian goddess. In the tea shops, conversations drifted from bread prices and weather forecasts to silk capes, feathered masks, and rumors of a string quartet being imported from Market Basing. Amidst this cheerful flutter, one peculiar detail passed almost unnoticed. The invitations bore the signature of Sir Geoffrey Pritchard, a retired colonial official now residing on the edge of the village at Pritchard Lodge. A man of distinguished bearing, Sir Geoffrey was not known for gaiety or elaborate gestures. His presence at parish meetings was marked by a kind of stern reserve, and he had once, it was whispered, dismissed the village cricket match as a rather provincial form of amusement. That such a man should sponsor a masquerade ball struck many as odd. Yet when Miss Hartnell, who prided herself on her ability to scrutinize documents, examined her invitation closely, she remarked that the signature did not quite match the one on a letter she had once received from him. The tale of the P, she insisted, was entirely different. She hinted darkly at forgery, though she admitted, after a pause, that she might have been mistaken. Still, the remark was enough to set one or two minds turning. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her neat little garden later that day, observed all this with mild curiosity. She sipped her tea while her knitting needles clicked gently, noting how swiftly excitement had spread through the village. She had long ago learned that collective enthusiasm often concealed a dozen smaller dramas. An unpaid debt, a quarrel between neighbors, a secret attachment revealed by a glance. In such currents of human behavior, she found more truth than in any official account. To the casual observer, she appeared to be merely considering the best method for preserving her geraniums through the autumn chill. But in reality, she was reflecting on the incongruity of Sir Geoffrey's supposed generosity. At last, the night of the ball arrived. Lanterns were strung across the high street, their soft glow mirrored in the glassy puddles left by an afternoon rain. The assembly rooms, ordinarily bare and functional, had been transformed. Garlands of greenery trailed from the rafters, and the stage was draped with velvet. A hired quartet played sprightly airs near the dais, while villagers in masks and costumes swirled about in giddy delight. The scent of punch, spiced and generous with brandy, hung in the air. There was laughter, the occasional shriek of merriment, and the rustle of silk. Miss Marple, in a simple gown of lavender and with a small lace mask that did nothing to disguise her, seated herself near the refreshment table. From that vantage she could observe the dancers without attracting notice. She saw the quarrel between a young man dressed as a highwayman and a lady in Grecian robes, sharp words muffled by the music, but unmistakable in their intensity. She noticed, too, a whispered exchange between two villagers near the punch bowl, a glance quickly averted when interrupted. To most, these were trifles, lost in the whirl of festivities. To Miss Marple, they were threads in a larger pattern. The clock struck 11, and the mood grew merrier still. Masks emboldened the timid and loosened the tongues of the reserve. Yet beneath the gaiety lingered something taut and expectant, as though everyone were waiting for an event not yet named. Sir Geoffrey himself was present, attired in an elaborate cloak and mask of black and silver. He moved stiffly, as though the role sat uneasily upon him, and exchanged only the briefest pleasantries. Still, his presence seemed to lend the affair its authority. It was near midnight when the merriment fractured. The quartet's music stopped mid-note, interrupted by a small cry from the far end of the hall. Dancers paused, masks turned, and a hush rippled through the room. From the curtained alcove beneath the gilt-framed portrait of a long-dead benefactor came a murmur, then a louder exclamation. Villagers pressed forward, curiosity swiftly mounting into alarm. There, half hidden by the heavy drapes, lay Sir Geoffrey Pritchard. His mask had slipped, revealing the unmistakable features of the man himself. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, and his hand rested limply upon the carpet. He was motionless, too motionless, and the pallor of his skin spoke volumes. On the floor beside him lay one of the invitation cards, its signature blurred and smudged, as though someone had pressed the ink before it dried. Whether dropped by chance or placed with intent, no one could yet say. Gasps and hurried whispers filled the hall. Someone shrieked, and someone else called for the doctor. The masquerade had ended in a manner no one had foreseen, and beneath the music, the laughter, and the silken costumes, there was now only silence and dread. Miss Marple, calm and unruffled, folded her hands neatly in her lap. Her eyes, bright with the light of quiet comprehension, missed nothing. The mystery had begun. The morning after the masquerade dawned pale and unsettled, as though even the weather had been disturbed by the night's events. A thin mist clung to the hedgerows, and the usually cheerful chirping of sparrows seemed subdued. In the village high street, shutters lifted slowly, and shopkeepers exchanged wary glances as they swept their doorsteps. For once, no one wished to begin the day with idle gossip, yet it was clear to all that gossip would arrive whether invited or not. By 10 o'clock, the post office had become the unofficial hub of speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley, stiff-backed and solemn, declared to a cluster of eager listeners that she had predicted disaster from the very beginning. "I said," she reminded them, tapping her umbrella on the tiles for emphasis, "that masks encourage deception. And you see, I was right." The butcher's wife, eager not to be left behind, insisted she had noticed Sir Geoffrey looking pale throughout the evening and was convinced it had been his heart. He was not a young man, she concluded, as though this were the final word on the matter. Others were less inclined to accept such a simple explanation. Leonard Clement, the vicar's nephew, leaned conspiratorially toward two friends, his eyes bright with the thrill of melodrama. "It was poison," he whispered, and slipped into his glass. Didn't you notice how his hand trembled when he lifted it?" His companions gasped and nodded, certain now that they too had seen the tremor. Such was the way with village recollections. Each person convinced themselves they had observed more than they truly had. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, bustled in soon after, clutching her handbag with nervous fingers. "Dr. Haydock will know," she assured anyone willing to listen. He examined Sir Geoffrey at once. It may have been a seizure, something quite natural, though tragic. She glanced anxiously, as though fearful the village might fall into hysteria without her steady words. Yet her assurances failed to quiet the tide of speculation, if anything. They only lent it a sharper edge. At the Blue Boar Inn, talk was equally heated. The landlord swore that Sir Geoffrey had been in fine spirits earlier that week when he came to settle his account, and suggested in a low voice that perhaps the retired official had not died of natural causes at all. This remark found fertile ground among the inn's patrons, who warmed quickly to theories of betrayal, secret enmities, and mysterious strangers in masks. More than one insisted they had seen a cloaked figure slipping away just before the cry went up in the hall. No two descriptions matched, yet each was recounted with utmost certainty. Miss Marple, for her part, remained as unruffled as ever. She accepted an invitation to morning tea while Mrs. Bantry listened politely as her friend recounted the entire affair with characteristic gusto. "It was dreadful, Jane," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, pouring tea with an unsteady hand. "Simply dreadful." There he was, laid out beneath that dreadful portrait, and everyone staring as though we were in a theatre. Poor Geoffrey, though I must say, I never cared for the way he looked down his nose at people. She paused, frowning. Still, no one deserves such an end. Miss Marple nodded, her expression composed. She did not interrupt, merely offering the occasional gentle murmur of agreement. Yet behind her serene demeanor, her mind was quietly at work. She recalled the blurred signature on the invitation card found beside Sir Geoffrey. The ink had seemed too fresh, too deliberate. To her it spoke not of chance, but of intention, though she was far too experienced to leap to conclusions. People, she often observed, were prone to misinterpret both their own observations and the actions of others. As the kettle steamed and the clock ticked gently on the mantelpiece, Miss Marple reflected on Sir Geoffrey himself. He had been a man of stern reputation, respected if not well liked. Stories circulated of his years abroad, of decisions made in faraway colonies, of wealth acquired under circumstances left vague. Such histories left their mark, not only upon the man, but upon those who surrounded him. Resentments, Miss Marple knew, could linger long after the world forgot their origin. Back in the High Street, Inspector Fray of the County Constabulary had arrived to make his inquiries. A tall man with a brisk manner, he preferred efficiency over delicacy, and his presence caused quite a stir. He stationed himself at the assembly rooms where villagers came one by one to recount what they had seen. The inspector listened, jotted down notes, and dismissed most accounts as fanciful. He was inclined, it seemed, to favor the simplest explanation that Sir Geoffrey had collapsed from natural causes in the midst of the ball. It was an untimely death, perhaps, but not necessarily suspicious. Still, he could not entirely ignore the whispers of a quarrel earlier in the evening. Several witnesses spoke of a heated exchange between Sir Geoffrey and a masked guest dressed as a highwayman. None could say what was said, nor identify the guest with certainty. The inspector raised an eyebrow and made a note, though his expression suggested he considered it no more than youthful bluster. Yet the story gained momentum as it traveled through the village until by afternoon it had transformed into a near duel, complete with raised voices and gestures toward hidden weapons. Miss Marple encountered the inspector briefly as she returned from Mrs. Bantry's. He greeted her politely but distractedly, eager to pursue more tangible leads. She inclined her head and let him pass, her thoughts quietly turning over what she had heard. Human nature, she reflected, was a curious thing. When faced with tragedy, some rushed to blame illness, others malice. In the end, both might be wrong, for the truth often lay concealed beneath layers of pride, fear, and old grudges. By evening, the entire village was alive with speculation. Curtains twitched as neighbors leaned close to share confidences. Lamps glowed late into the night as families rehearsed every detail of the masquerade, each convinced they alone had noticed some vital clue. And through it all, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting calmly, her mind sorting through the threads of behavior she had observed. The nervous laughter, the quarrel in the corner, the blurred signature left like a token beside the body. She did not yet know where these threads would lead, but she had faith they would weave themselves into a pattern soon enough. Outside, the mist thickened once more, wrapping the village in quiet secrecy. Beneath its cover, the truth of Sir Geoffrey's death remained hidden, but Miss Marple, with her gentle eyes and steady patience, was already preparing to uncover it. The following morning brought little relief to the village. Though the mist had lifted, the air remained heavy with the residue of unanswered questions. The church bell rang for morning service, and though the pews were filled, the prayers of the congregation carried a distracted note. Whispered exchanges during the hymns betrayed that Sir Geoffrey Pritchard's sudden death had not yet settled into the category of accepted tragedy. Instead, it hovered uneasily between accident and suspicion, and no one could quite decide which was the more unsettling. Inspector Cray had returned with renewed determination. He was not a man to be swayed by gossip, yet he recognized the need to appear thorough. He arranged to interview key witnesses one by one in the small office adjoining the assembly rooms. The makeshift interrogation chamber smelled faintly of polish and old curtains. Chairs were drawn up, and a constable stood by the door to give proceedings the gravity they required. Villagers filed in nervously, some eager to speak, others reluctant, all mindful that their words might place them at the center of attention. First came young Leonard Clement, still flushed with the excitement of drama. He recounted the quarrel he had seen between Sir Geoffrey and the masked highwayman, adding color and flourish to his memory. The inspector frowned, aware that youth's imagination often embroidered facts. Still, the details were noted. Then came Millicent Bantry, pale in her Grecian costume, who admitted that Sir Geoffrey had spoken to her curtly earlier in the evening about her behavior. He said, she whispered, that young ladies should mind their manners. I was dreadfully embarrassed. She insisted she bore him no ill will, yet the inspector marked her words carefully, for embarrassment, however slight, could deepen into resentment. Miss Marple, though not summoned formally, found herself gently ushered into the office by the inspector. He regarded her with polite courtesy, yet his tone suggested he had no expectation of useful information. "You were seated by the refreshment table, I believe," he said. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, replied in her soft voice that she had observed many small things, though she would not presume to judge their importance. She mentioned the quarrel, the hurried whispers near the punch bowl, and the curious way Sir Geoffrey had declined nearly every glass offered him, excepting only one late in the evening. Inspector Cray raised an eyebrow, his pencil pausing. "Declined drinks, did he?" he muttered. "That's interesting." He thanked her politely, though his manner conveyed the faintest trace of indulgence, as though humoring a kindly old lady. Meanwhile, Dr. Haydock, the village physician, delivered his preliminary report. Sir Geoffrey's death, he declared, was consistent with a sudden seizure or collapse of the heart. He could not rule out natural causes, yet neither could he entirely dismiss the possibility of something introduced into his system. The lack of immediate signs made certainty impossible. A man of his age and constitution, the doctor remarked, may fall without warning. Yet one cannot ignore the circumstances, the blurred signature, the timing, the quarrel. they leave an unpleasant taste. His words, repeated in hushed tones throughout the village, carried greater weight than any official pronouncement. Miss Marple returned home to her garden that afternoon, where the scent of chrysanthemums drifted through the air. She reflected quietly on the doctor's words. Human nature, she mused, was often more decisive than medical evidence. A quarrel here, a bitter word there, these left impressions more indelible than any poison. She thought of Sir Geoffrey's years abroad, of decisions made with stern authority, of people slighted or overlooked. In her experience, resentments had a way of lying dormant, only to emerge when least expected. The inspector, meanwhile, pursued his inquiries with diligence. He learned that the invitations had been posted from Market Basing, not St. Mary Mead. This discovery unsettled him. Why should Sir Geoffrey, who lived only half a mile from the assembly rooms, take the trouble to post invitations from a neighboring town? When he put the question to Sir Geoffrey's housekeeper, she shook her head firmly. "I never saw him write a one of them," she insisted. The master had no time for such trifles. He was particular about his correspondence, never signing anything without checking it twice. The inspector frowned, for this testimony lent credence to the rumor that the signature had been forged. That evening, at the Blue Boar, theories abounded. Some argued that Sir Geoffrey himself had orchestrated the masquerade to draw out an enemy. Others whispered that he had uncovered a scandal involving village finances and that his silence had been bought with death. Each tale grew more elaborate in the telling, fueled by candlelight and ale. Yet amidst the clamour, one fact remained. A man had died in the middle of a celebration, and no one could yet explain why. Miss Marple, listening quietly to Mrs. Bantry's retelling of the latest rumours, thought of a small but telling detail. She recalled how Sir Geoffrey, standing stiffly in his mask and cloak, had seemed ill at ease, as though playing a role thrust upon him. She remembered the faint hesitation before he entered the hall, a hesitation noticed by none but herself. To her, it suggested that the evening had not been of his making. If the ball had not been his idea, then whose had it been? That question, simple yet overlooked, might prove the key to the whole affair. By the close of the day, the inspector announced that further examination would be required before any conclusion could be drawn. Sir Geoffrey's body would be sent to the county for post-mortem analysis, and until then, all talk of foul play must remain speculative. The villagers accepted this pronouncement with varying degrees of patience, though few believed their questions would be silenced by official caution. As lamps glowed in cottage windows and the night settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. She thought of blurred ink, hesitant gestures, and human pride. She knew that beneath the surface of every village lay unspoken grievances, and that in those grievances one might find the truth. For now, she would wait, watch, and listen, certain that the pattern would reveal itself in due time. The investigation had only just begun, by the third day after the Masquerade. St. Mary Mead had settled into a curious rhythm. The ordinary routines of life, shopping, sweeping steps, tending gardens, went on as usual, yet every action seemed infused with the same quiet question: who among them might have wished Sir Geoffrey dead? It was as if the entire village walked in the shadow of suspicion, each word carefully measured, each glance weighed by neighbours who suddenly found menace in the most trivial of gestures. Inspector Cray had taken up temporary residence at the Blue Boar Inn, and his daily walks through the High Street became something of a performance. Villagers watched from behind curtains as he stopped to question this person or that, his notebook at the ready. He preferred a direct manner, his questions plain, but to the villagers of St. Mary Mead, even the plainest question seemed charged with implication. To be summoned by the inspector was to be placed, however briefly, in the dock of public opinion. The first to feel the weight of that attention was Mr. Henry Lawton, a solicitor from Market Basing who had only recently moved into a small cottage on the edge of the village. He had attended the masquerade dressed as a highwayman, complete with mask and cape. Several witnesses, including Leonard Clement, insisted he had quarrelled with Sir Geoffrey during the evening. Lartin admitted as much when pressed, though he downplayed the severity. "A mere misunderstanding," he explained. "He accused me of stepping on his cloak. Hardly a cause for enmity. Yet his evasive manner, combined with his newcomer's status, made him an easy subject of gossip. Some whispered that he had once lost a legal case against Sir Geoffrey years before, and that his presence at the ball was no coincidence." Another name soon arose, Millicent Bantry. The inspector, having heard repeated accounts of her brief clash with Sir Geoffrey, summoned her for questioning. Millicent, ordinarily full of youthful cheer, appeared pale and subdued. She admitted that Sir Geoffrey had spoken to her sharply, chastising her behavior during the dance. "He said I should not laugh so loudly," she told the inspector, her eyes lowered, "as though I were a child." Though she insisted she had taken no offense, her mother's anxious glances and the nervous whispers of her peers suggested otherwise. Youthful indignation, after all, was fertile ground for conjecture. Then there was Sir Geoffrey's own household. His housekeeper, Mrs. Sedgwick, spoke with trembling hands as she poured tea for the inspector. She maintained that her master had been in good health, though she admitted he had seemed unusually restless in the days before the masquerade. He would pace the study, sir, muttering under his breath. I asked if he was unwell, but he waved me off. The inspector pressed her gently, and at last she conceded that Sir Geoffrey had received a letter shortly before the invitations were posted. The envelope, she recalled, bore no return address. What had become of it, she could not say. Such a detail, small yet suggestive, only deepened the mystery. At Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, the matter was discussed with unabashed frankness. "It must be that solicitor," Mrs. Bantry declared, her voice full of conviction. "He quarrelled with Sir Geoffrey in plain view of half the village. If that isn't evidence, I don't know what is." Colonel Bantry, less inclined to certainty, suggested it might have been Millicent, if only to add fuel to the fire. "Young people act rashly," he remarked. "One never knows what offence they might take." Mrs. Bantry dismissed the suggestion indignantly, though the seed of doubt lingered in the air. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her corner with her knitting, listened without comment. She knew well the village's tendency to fasten upon the obvious suspect, ignoring the subtler truths hidden in human nature. Mr. Lartin and Millicent Bantry might indeed have quarrelled with Sir Geoffrey, but quarrels were as common as weeds in any garden. Rarely did they flower into murder. What interested Miss Marple was the curious matter of the invitations, posted not from the village but from Market Basing, and bearing a signature that many swore did not match the deceased's hand. A forgery implied planning, and planning implied motive of a far more deliberate kind. Inspector Cray, though cautious, allowed his attention to rest heavily upon Lartin. The man's evasiveness, combined with his role in the quarrel, gave the inspector grounds for suspicion. He arranged for a closer look into Lartin's background, sending inquiries to legal colleagues in Market Basing. He also pressed the housekeeper further, seeking details about Sir Geoffrey's final days. Yet the more he asked, the more fragmented the picture became. A man restless, a quarrel at a dance, a blurred signature on an invitation card. None of it fit neatly together. Meanwhile, the villagers drew their own conclusions. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley announced that she had seen Lartin speaking in hushed tones with Sir Geoffrey a week before the ball, and she was certain it had been no friendly conversation. At the post office, the talk turned to Millicent Bantry, whose pale appearance after the inspector's questioning was interpreted as guilt rather than youthful anxiety. Each conversation added a layer of certainty, though none added a scrap of proof. Miss Marple returned home that evening and sat by her hearth, the lamplight glinting on her knitting needles. She reflected on the inspector's methods, on the village's speculations, and on her own quiet observations. Human nature, she reminded herself, rarely displayed itself in grand gestures. More often, it revealed itself in the smallest of details, a hesitation in speech, a glance swiftly averted, a signature blurred where it should have been firm. It was not the quarrel itself that intrigued her, but the fact that Sir Geoffrey had seemed so ill at ease throughout the evening, as though aware of a danger he could not quite name. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Miss Marple considered the question that lay beneath all others who had wanted the masquerade to happen. Not who had attended, nor who had quarrelled, but who had conceived of such an event in the first place. It was a question no one else seemed to be asking, yet to her it was the most vital of all. For in answering it, she believed the true nature of Sir Geoffrey's death might at last come into focus. The days following Inspector Cray's inquiries carried with them an air of unease, as though the village itself had fallen under suspicion. Neighbours greeted one another politely enough, but there lingered a wariness in every smile and hesitation, in every word. Even the clatter of teacups in the local tea-room seemed subdued, as though each delicate sound might draw unwelcome attention. The masquerade had become more than a tragic memory. It was now a touchstone for speculation, suspicion, and fear. Inspector Cray pressed forward with his investigation, determined to find a direction amidst the fog of rumour. His inclination remained toward Mr. Henry Larton, the solicitor from Market Basing. The quarrel at the masquerade, the whispers of a past legal dispute, and his newcomer's status all pointed conveniently toward him. Yet Cray, for all his focus, found little in the way of tangible evidence. He examined Larton's papers, his accounts, and even spoke with colleagues from Market Basing, but discovered only a man whose professional life had been neither particularly brilliant nor particularly disgraced. The inspector was left with little more than suspicion, which he found increasingly unsatisfactory. Meanwhile, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. She attended the Women's Institute, listened to the chatter at the post office, and allowed herself to be drawn into the speculation of her neighbours. Outwardly, she appeared as she always did, mild, interested, and unobtrusive. Yet inwardly, her mind sifted the fragments of information with meticulous care. It was not the grand quarrels or dramatic declarations that interested her, but the smaller details, the things others overlooked, precisely because they seemed so trivial. One such detail came to her attention on a visit to Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife. They sat together in the parlour, knitting and exchanging thoughts about the tragic events. Mrs. Clement, in her earnest way, confided that she had worried throughout the evening about the refreshment table. It was dreadful, she explained, the way people crowded about, masks pressing close, hands reaching here and there. I kept thinking how easily something might be spilled or even slipped into the punch without anyone noticing. She shook her head anxiously, her needles clicking with greater speed. Why, at one point, I thought I saw a hand near the bowl, though I could not say whose. I told myself it must have been imagination. Miss Marple listened carefully, her expression serene. She asked, quite innocently, whether Mrs. Clement had noticed what Sir Geoffrey drank. Mrs. Clement hesitated, then shook her head. Now that you ask, I cannot recall him taking more than a sip of anything. He seemed almost reluctant, as though every glass pressed upon him was an imposition, but near the end of the night he accepted 1 cup of punch. I remember because I thought it was unusual. He was not a man who enjoyed frivolities, you know. Miss Marple smiled gently and changed the subject, but inwardly her thoughts stirred. A man who refused drinks throughout the evening, only to accept one near the end, might not have done so by chance. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the high street, pausing to chat with the shopkeepers. At the greengrocer's, she overheard a telling remark. Mrs. Price Ridley, in full voice, insisted she had seen Millicent Bantry carrying 2 glasses of punch shortly before midnight. She gave one to that young man dressed as a cavalier, she declared, and the other she pressed upon Sir Geoffrey himself. I thought about her, but she is young after all." The remark was received with eager nods, though its significance seemed lost on those present. To Miss Marple, it was another thread in the growing pattern. That evening, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple reflected on the blurred signature found beside Sir Geoffrey's body. It had troubled her from the first moment. A blurred signature suggested haste, yet the invitation cards had been posted well before the masquerade. Why would anyone be writing Sir Geoffrey's name in fresh ink on the very night he died? Unless, of course, it was meant to serve as some form of message, a token left deliberately. She considered the psychology of such an act. People, she knew, often betrayed themselves in the manner of their gestures. A smudged signature might be arrogance, an attempt to prove cleverness, or it might be fear, a compulsion to underline a falsehood. Either way, it was not the sort of clue Inspector Cray was likely to value, yet to Miss Marple it felt central. The inspector, meanwhile, announced that the post-mortem results had been inconclusive. No clear trace of poison had been found, though the possibility could not be ruled out. This only deepened the sense of uncertainty. If not poison, then what? If not illness, then how? Villagers leaned eagerly into the void of knowledge, each filling it with theories of their own. Some whispered that Sir Geoffrey had been struck down by a curse from his years abroad. Others claimed that he had been silenced for fear he might reveal some dreadful secret. None of these speculations brought the inspector any closer to an answer. Miss Marple, however, continued to dwell on the subtleties. She recalled the way Sir Geoffrey had entered the hall, stiff and hesitant, as though dreading the occasion. She remembered the brief glance he gave, toward the alcove where he was later found, as if it already held significance for him. She thought of Mrs. Clement's remark about the crowded refreshment table and of Mrs. Price Ridley's certainty that Millicent Bantry had given him the only drink he accepted. To others, these were fragments. To her, they were pieces of a larger design. On Sunday afternoon after service, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, speaking gently with Dr. Haydock. The doctor, though cautious, admitted that Sir Geoffrey had been under greater strain than he liked to admit. The man carried tension in every muscle, he said quietly. Whatever his life abroad, it left him restless. I sometimes thought he lived with some unspoken burden. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression thoughtful. A burden unspoken, combined with a masquerade not of his own design, hinted at forces beyond mere happenstance. That night, as the autumn wind rattled the branches outside her cottage, Miss Marple sat in her chair, knitting folded upon her lap. She reflected on the truth she had learned again and again, that the smallest things, the placement of a glass, the smudge of a pen, the nervous glance of a guest were often the keys that unlocked the most elaborate puzzles. She had no intention yet of voicing her suspicions, for the pattern was incomplete, but she knew, with quiet certainty, that the answer lay not in the quarrel with Mr. Larton or the embarrassment of young Millicent, but in the subtle detail overlooked by others. And so, while the inspector pursued his inquiries into quarrels and grudges, Miss Marple prepared herself to follow a different path, one marked not by dramatic gestures, but by the faint and delicate clues that others dismissed as inconsequential. In those, she believed, the truth about Sir Geoffrey's death would finally be revealed. By the end of the week, the village had grown restless beneath the weight of unanswered questions. Suspicion, once a vague mist that hung in the air, began to cling to individuals like a damp cloak. Old grievances resurfaced, whispered tales were sharpened into accusations, and the genteel surface of St. Mary Mead life cracked just enough to reveal the bitterness beneath. Inspector Cray, though determined, found himself drawn into these undercurrents. Each new interview seemed to uncover a half-buried quarrel or a long-forgotten slight. He had started with the obvious suspects, but as he listened, the circle widened. Sir Geoffrey Pritchard, for all his distinguished bearing, had not been universally admired. Respect, perhaps, Deference, certainly, but affection was scarce. And in the absence of affection, resentments found fertile ground. At the Blue Boar one evening, Mr. Henry Larton confronted his accusers. Tired of the endless speculation, he raised his voice in protest, declaring that his quarrel with Sir Geoffrey had been nothing more than an exchange of words. "Do you imagine," he demanded, "that a man of my profession would risk all for such a petty disagreement?" His tone carried both indignation and defensiveness, which only served to harden the villagers' suspicions. A solicitor's skill with words, they reasoned, could be as much a weapon as a blade. Meanwhile, whispers spread about Millicent Bantry. Several guests at the Masquerade recalled seeing her offer the glass of punch to Sir Geoffrey, the same glass he reluctantly accepted. Some hinted that she had done so under the encouragement of a companion. Others insisted she had acted on a dare, an innocent gesture now magnified by tragic consequence. Millicent herself grew increasingly pale under the scrutiny, her usual brightness subdued into nervous silence. Mrs. Bantry defended her daughter fiercely, but her indignation did little to quiet the wagging tongues. Within Sir Geoffrey's own household, new tensions came to light. The housekeeper, Mrs. Sedgwick, was overheard by a neighbour arguing with the gardener about the late master's will. She claimed she had been promised a bequest, though nothing in writing had been shown. The gardener scoffed, suggesting she had imagined the promise. Their voices, though hushed, carried through the open window, and by the next morning the entire village knew of it. The possibility that Sir Geoffrey's death might affect financial matters cast yet another shadow over those closest to him. Inspector Cray pressed Mrs. Sedgwick on the subject, and though she denied any wrongdoing, her hands trembled as she poured his tea. She admitted that Sir Geoffrey had spoken often of altering his will, though he had delayed doing so. He feared the solicitor's fees, she confessed with a nervous laugh, though he had money enough to spare. The inspector noted the statement carefully, recognizing that disputes over inheritance had sparked darker deeds in quieter villages than this one. Miss Marple, while the inspector pursued these confrontations, continued her own unobtrusive inquiries. She spoke gently with Millicent Bantry, not of accusations, but of the Masquerade itself. Millicent, reassured by the old lady's kindly manner, confessed that she had indeed given Sir Geoffrey the drink, but only because she thought it rude to refuse when others were pressing him. "He looked so dreadfully severe," she whispered, "and I thought perhaps if he joined in, he might appear less forbidding." Miss Marple nodded with understanding, her eyes soft but thoughtful. It was not guilt she detected in Millicent, but a kind of youthful eagerness to please, so easily misinterpreted by others. At the same time, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Sedgwick under the pretense of inquiring about chrysanthemums. Over tea, the housekeeper revealed, quite unguardedly, that Sir Geoffrey had received more than one anonymous letter in recent months. "Ugly things," she said, lowering her voice. "Accusations, threats, the like. He burned them straight away, but I know they troubled him. He would mutter under his breath afterward, as though rehearsing arguments with unseen enemies." Miss Marple listened intently, her knitting resting lightly in her lap. Anonymous letters were rarely the work of strangers. They were the product of familiarity and resentment, sharpened into malice. The revelation spread quickly once it was whispered beyond the walls of Pritchard Lodge. Soon, half the village was speculating about who might have written the letters. Some accused Mr. Larton, whose quarrel at the Masquerade seemed now to fit a larger pattern of hostility. Others suggested the gardener, who had long felt underappreciated. Still others pointed fingers at distant acquaintances, eager to push suspicion beyond their own circles. The inspector, weary of unsubstantiated tales, grew irritable. Yet he could not ignore the undercurrent of truth. Sir Geoffrey had been a man surrounded by simmering resentments. That Sunday, the tension erupted more openly. At the churchyard after service, Mrs. Price Ridley accused Millicent directly of placing the fatal glass in Sir Geoffrey's hand. "You pushed it upon him," she said loudly, her voice sharp enough to draw a crowd. "You were the last to see him drink." Millicent, stricken, denied it tearfully, while her mother rose to her defense. Colonel Bantry stepped in to restore order, but not before the damage had been done. The confrontation left Millicent shaken and the village buzzing with renewed certainty of her guilt. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, observed the scene with calm eyes. She noted not only the words spoken, but the faces of those who listened. Some betrayed relief that suspicion had shifted from themselves. Others showed too much eagerness to believe the worst. Such reactions, she knew, often revealed more than the accusations themselves. The truth, she reminded herself, was rarely shouted aloud. It was whispered in the small, unguarded moments of human behavior. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor, the fire casting gentle shadows on the walls. She reflected on the events of the day, on the housekeeper's mention of anonymous letters, on Millicent's earnest but misinterpreted gesture, on Mr. Larden's defensiveness. She thought, too, of the smudged signature, and of Sir Geoffrey's reluctance to enter the masquerade hall. To others, these were disconnected fragments. To her, they were pieces of a puzzle whose outline was slowly taking shape. The village might be consumed with loud confrontations and whispered secrets, but Miss Marple understood that the true key lay hidden among the smallest details, the things overlooked in the heat of accusation. And though she remained silent for now, her mind was quietly preparing for the moment when those details would form a pattern clear enough to reveal the truth. The atmosphere in St. Mary Mead, already strained, was thrown into greater turmoil when an unexpected discovery unsettled the village once more. It occurred on a grey Thursday morning when the gardener from Pritchard Lodge arrived breathless at the police station with a bundle clutched under his arm. He had been clearing a shed behind the late Sir Geoffrey's residence, he explained, when he stumbled upon a stack of papers hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Among them was a torn fragment of one of the infamous anonymous letters written in a hand that appeared deliberately disguised. Inspector Fray, called at once to examine the find, read the words aloud with deliberate gravity, "You shall not escape your past forever." The phrase, stark and uncompromising, spread through the village like wildfire. Suddenly, speculation about Sir Geoffrey's death turned darker still. The inspector seized upon the discovery with fresh energy. He summoned Mrs. Sedgwick, who insisted she knew nothing of the letter's hiding place, though she admitted Sir Geoffrey had been unusually secretive of late. "He would not allow me to touch his study," she confessed. "Even dusting was forbidden." To the inspector, it suggested that Sir Geoffrey had been shielding more than simple correspondence. The possibility of blackmail began to take shape in his mind, and with it a wider pool of suspects. Who in the village might have knowledge of Sir Geoffrey's past, and who would dare exploit it? The revelation of the letter fragments sent tongues wagging at a new pitch. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley claimed she had seen Mr. Larden with a slip of paper that very morning, though when pressed, she admitted it might have been no more than a bill. At the Blue Boar, the landlord confided to regulars that Sir Geoffrey had once spoken of enemies left behind in distant lands. Some suggested that one of those enemies had followed him to St. Mary Mead, disguised in a mask and cloak, striking at the Masquerade. Each tale grew more elaborate as the hours passed, until by evening the entire village was aflame with suspicion. Meanwhile, a second twist emerged, one not of rumor, but of action. Millicent Bantry, still shaken from being accused so publicly in the churchyard, vanished from her home for several hours without explanation. Her absence, quickly noted by observant neighbors, was interpreted as flight. When she returned, pale and trembling, she offered only that she had gone to walk by the river, needing air. To the inspector, her disappearance seemed an attempt to evade questioning, though to Miss Marple it looked rather like the impulsive escape of a frightened young girl cornered by gossip. Yet the damage was done. By nightfall, half the village was convinced Millicent was concealing some dreadful secret. Inspector Cray arranged to question her again, this time with sharper insistence. He pressed her about the drink she had offered Sir Geoffrey, about her absence that afternoon, about any knowledge of the letters. Millicent denied all with a trembling voice, tears springing to her eyes. "I did not harm him," she pleaded. "I only wanted to be kind. I thought if he laughed, even for a moment, people would see he was not so stern." Her words, though sincere, did little to soften the inspector's suspicions. To him, the inconsistencies were too many. To Miss Marple, listening quietly in the background, they rang true of youth's naive attempts to make sense of adult malice. The twist deepened further when Dr. Haydock revealed an overlooked detail from the post-mortem examination. Traces of a rare sedative had been found in Sir Geoffrey's system, not enough to kill outright, but sufficient to weaken a man already under strain. It suggested deliberate interference, even if the cause of death was ultimately his heart. The inspector seized upon this as proof of foul play. "We have moved beyond conjecture," he declared. "Someone administered that drug, and we must discover who." The news electrified the village. No longer could the death be dismissed as natural. It was, in the eyes of all, a murder. For Miss Marple, the revelation confirmed what she had quietly suspected. A deliberate hand had guided events, cloaking malice beneath the appearance of festivity. Yet she also understood that the sedative was but one piece of the pattern. A man such as Sir Geoffrey did not inspire enmity for trivial reasons. The letters, the masquerade, the blurred signature all pointed to a design more intricate than mere happenstance. She reflected that those who devised elaborate schemes often overlooked the smallest of details, and it was there she would find her answer. That evening, at Mrs. Bantry's, the conversation turned feverish. Colonel Bantry insisted the sedative must have been slipped into the punch, while his wife argued that it was more likely placed in a private glass. Others speculated about who had access to. Medicine's Dr. Haydock's name surfaced, though immediately dismissed by those who trusted his integrity. Still, the whispers spread. If a sedative had been administered, someone in the village had knowledge of drugs, and that knowledge narrowed the field considerably. Miss Marple said little, though her mind ticked steadily onward. She thought of the glass pressed into Sir Geoffrey's hand, of the housekeeper's mention of anonymous letters, of Millicent's frightened sincerity, and of Mr. Larton's defensiveness. She thought, too, of the curious psychology of the masquerade itself, a gathering designed to obscure identities, yet also to reveal them. Those who hid behind masks often betrayed themselves in subtler ways, a gesture, a phrase, a hesitation. She had seen such betrayals before, and she trusted she would see them again. As the village settled into uneasy silence that night, the sense of menace deepened. The discovery of the letter fragment, Millicent's unexplained absence, and the doctor's revelation of the sedative had twisted the investigation into new and darker channels. The masquerade no longer seemed a frivolous diversion that had ended in tragedy. It appeared instead as the centerpiece of a carefully orchestrated design, one whose hidden purpose had yet to be fully revealed. Miss Marple, seated alone by her fire, allowed herself a single quiet reflection of human nature, with all its jealousies and vanities, and was the most reliable witness of all. And she knew with calm certainty that it was about to betray the truth more openly than it had thus far dared. The revelation of the sedative had set the village into a new stage of unease, one that bordered on fear. Before, there had been whispers, conjecture, and rumor. Now there was certainty that someone among them had acted with deliberate malice. To live in St. Mary Mead was suddenly to live with suspicion, breathing down one's neck. Shopkeepers watched their customers a little more closely. Parish meetings ended earlier than usual, as if darkness itself carried menace. Even children were hushed by their mothers, told not to linger in the lanes after dusk. A sense of something unfinished, unresolved, clung to the air. Inspector Cray, though confident the investigation had reached a turning point, still found his net empty of proof. Mr. Larton remained under heavy suspicion, but no evidence tied him to the sedative or to the anonymous letters. Millicent Bantry's actions were suspicious in appearance, but rang hollow as actual guilt. The housekeeper's trembling hands and veiled remarks pointed toward secrets, but nothing that could be named. Each suspect carried weight, but none carried certainty. The inspector pressed harder, yet the tighter he pulled the threads, the more tangled they became. It was at this point that Miss Marple, quietly attentive, decided the time had come for her own form of investigation. She knew from long experience that truth often emerged not under the inspector's stern questioning, but in moments of casual conversation when a suspect believed themselves unnoticed. Human nature was never so revealing as when it thought it was safe. And so she prepared what she considered a small test, nothing more than a simple observation, though she trusted it might bring her closer to the answer. Her opportunity arrived during an afternoon gathering at Mrs. Bantry's drawing room. The usual circle was present: Mrs. Price, Ridley, brisk and watchful, Mrs. Clement, anxious but eager to help, and Colonel Bantry, who pretended indifference but listened keenly. To this group was added Mr. Larton, who had come in an effort to defend his reputation, and Mrs. Sedgwick, drawn reluctantly into the circle by curiosity. The conversation inevitably turned to the masquerade once more, and to the peculiar business of the smudged signature. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, remarked in her gentle way that it was curious how handwriting could reveal so much about a person's character. "Why," she said with a mild smile, "I've often thought one can tell a temper from the slope of a letter. A nervous soul presses too hard, leaving the ink to blot, while a confident one writes with a steady hand. I have even known a case where the writer, seeking to disguise himself, left behind a telltale loop he could not resist." Her tone was so soft, so seemingly inconsequential, that most simply nodded politely. But Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, did not miss the small reactions. Mr. Larton shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on his teacup. Mrs. Sedgwick glanced quickly at the carpet, as though recalling something she had seen. Colonel Bantry gave a laugh, dismissing the notion, but his wife leaned forward, intrigued. "Do you really believe so, Jane?" she asked. Miss Marple only smiled, her needles clicking steadily. "One observes patterns, that is all. And patterns, you know, are very difficult to hide." Later, as the guests departed, Miss Marple reflected on the responses she had witnessed. It was not guilt she sought, but reaction. Those who had nothing to conceal would hear her remark as an idle fancy. Those with secrets would betray themselves in a glance, a twitch, or a silence. Already she felt certain the truth lay not in the louder quarrels, but in the quiet evasions. That evening, she invited Millicent Bantry for tea, determined to give the girl comfort and perhaps a chance to speak freely. Millicent arrived subdued, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. Over a plate of seed cake, Miss Marple guided the conversation gently back to the masquerade. "It is so easy, my dear," she said kindly, "to misjudge an action when the whole village is watching. You gave Sir Geoffrey that glass in kindness, did you not?" Millicent's relief at the understanding tone was palpable. "Yes, Miss Marple, I swear it." I thought it might soften him. Everyone was saying how grim he looked. Tears welled in her eyes. I never imagined it could be the glass that harmed him. Miss Marple patted her hand. "I believe you, child." "Truly, I do. But sometimes, you see, others make use of kindness. They place the burden upon innocent shoulders so that the truth remains hidden." Millicent looked startled but comforted, and in that moment Miss Marple confirmed her impression that the girl was no murderer. Fear made people act rashly, but fear was not the same as guilt. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray continued his official questioning, yet his path seemed no clearer. He pursued the matter of the sedative, discovering that Dr. Haydock kept such compounds locked away, but that a small quantity had gone missing some weeks before. The discovery alarmed him. To his mind, it narrowed the suspect list to those with access to the doctor's surgery, or to those close enough to him to borrow a key. Yet the doctor himself, affronted at the suggestion of negligence, insisted that his cupboards were secure. Unless, he admitted reluctantly, someone very familiar with my habits had an opportunity. His eyes narrowed as he spoke, and though he named no one, the implication did not escape notice. Miss Marple, hearing of this from Mrs. Clement, later considered it carefully. Medicines, she knew, were not mysteries in themselves. Many households kept tonics, sleeping draughts, or nerve restoratives. It was not access alone that mattered, but intent. Who, among all those present at the masquerade, had both the opportunity to slip the sedative into Sir Geoffrey's glass and the motive to do so? She had begun to form a picture, faint and incomplete, yet growing clearer with every passing day. Her test at Mrs. Bantry had provided a small but valuable clue, a reaction, brief but telling. Human nature, Miss Marple reminded herself, always showed itself in the end, even in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. All that remained was to watch, to wait, and to listen for the final slip, the one that would transform suspicion into certainty. As she folded away her knitting that night and settled into her chair by the fire, Miss Marple reflected with quiet satisfaction that the truth was drawing nearer. The masquerade, with its masks and disguises, had been designed to confuse, yet no mask, however cleverly worn, could entirely conceal the nature beneath. And soon, very soon, that nature would betray its owner. The village, by now, was taut with unease. Each day brought new theories, each evening new whispers exchanged in shadowed parlors. The masquerade had ceased to be a memory. It had become a living wound in the life of St. Mary Mead. People hurried through the lanes, doors were locked earlier, and conversations that once drifted comfortably toward weather and crops now circled grimly around sedatives, signatures, and suspicions. It was as though the masquerade's masks had never been removed, and every villager still carried one unseen. Inspector Cray, increasingly frustrated, pressed his inquiries with sharper insistence. He revisited Larton, demanding explanations for inconsistencies in his account. Why had he been seen with Sir Geoffrey days before the masquerade? Why did his story of the quarrel change each time it was retold? Larton grew defensive, his voice rising. "A man cannot recall every word spoken," he snapped, though his flushed face betrayed discomfort. The inspector left unsatisfied, certain that guilt lingered somewhere close, yet still out of reach. In the Bantry household, Millicent's distress deepened. Though Miss Marple had given her comfort, the girl could not escape the weight of public suspicion. Even friends she had known since childhood avoided her eyes in the high street. Colonel Bantry, determined to shield his daughter, confronted the inspector himself, demanding her name be cleared. But Cray, cautious, offered only that the matter was still under review. To the colonel's military mind, this was as good as an accusation. Tempers flared, and the village felt the tension of a storm about to break. Meanwhile, Mrs. Sedgwick grew more withdrawn. Once willing to speak freely, she now avoided questions altogether, offering clipped responses and hurrying away. Her behavior was interpreted by many as evidence of guilt. Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on sharp perception, told half the village that she had seen the housekeeper leaving the doctor's surgery one evening weeks before the masquerade. She was not there for a tonic, Mrs. Price Ridley insisted. Mark my words, she was after something she ought not have touched. The claim, repeated from one doorstep to another, gathered force with each telling. Miss Marple, however, remained unshaken. She continued her quiet inquiries, careful never to appear inquisitive. She visited Mrs. Clement under the pretext of discussing the harvest festival, and in the course of conversation asked about the letter fragment. Mrs. Clement, who had a habit of remembering small details, remarked that she had once seen Sir Geoffrey carefully blotting his signature at a parish meeting. He was meticulous, she said. Never once did his hand smudge. If there was a blurred signature on that card, Jane, it cannot have been his. The remark, spoken with simple certainty, confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected. The smudged ink was not only false, it was careless. Someone had wished to mimic authority, but lacked the discipline of a man accustomed to precise habits. To Miss Marple, the forgery revealed more than it concealed. It spoke of arrogance, a belief that the villagers would not notice, or that their doubts would matter little once the plan was complete. She knew well from her years of observation that arrogance was often the undoing of clever schemes. Her next step was equally quiet. At the vicarage tea-gathering, she steered conversation toward the subject of medicines, remarking innocently how useful a sedative could be in easing sleeplessness. Most nodded politely, but one among them betrayed a flicker of unease at the mention. It was fleeting, the kind of reaction others might miss, but Miss Marple saw it clearly. In that brief tightening of the lips, in the quick dart of the eyes, she read confirmation that her suspicions were beginning to align. Inspector Fray, unaware of the subtle game being played, pushed forward with more force. He spoke openly of the sedative, of the letters, of the quarrel. He declared that an arrest would soon be made, though he offered no name. His blunt approach unsettled the village further. Innocent or guilty, many felt the inspector's gaze upon them, and the sense of collective guilt grew heavier still. The very air of St. Mary Mead seemed charged with tension, like the moments before a summer storm. Miss Marple, seated by her fire that evening, reviewed the pattern in her mind. She thought of the forged invitation, the sedative, the frightened sincerity of Millicent, the housekeeper's evasions, and Larton's defensiveness. Each piece, when viewed in isolation, suggested uncertainty, but together they formed a picture. She was not ready to reveal it, not yet. Timing mattered. A premature accusation would allow the guilty to retreat into denial. No, the moment must be carefully chosen, and when it came, she would act with precision. The storm broke not with thunder, but with another discovery. Late that night, the gardener stumbled across a small bottle hidden among the tools in the shed. Its label, though smudged, bore the unmistakable name of a sedative compound. The inspector was summoned, and by morning the entire village knew of it. At last, here was proof of deliberate action, yet the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Who had placed it there? Who had access to the shed? And why conceal it where it might so easily be found? The discovery sent fear rippling through the community. If the murderer was so close as to use familiar ground for concealment, then no one could feel safe. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, doors closed against friendly callers, and the sense of menace deepened. It was no longer a question of whether Sir Geoffrey had been murdered. It was now a question of when the murderer would be unmasked. Miss Marple, calm as ever, knew the time was near. She had watched, she had listened, and she had tested the patterns of human nature. The storm had gathered long enough. Soon she would draw the circle tight and allow the truth to reveal itself, and when it did, she would be ready. The air in St. Mary Mead had grown heavy with dread, and the village seemed to wait as though holding its breath. Each cottage window glowed faintly against the dark autumn evenings. Yet behind those curtains, conversation turned only toward the same subject. The bottle found in the shed, the letters, the sedative, the masquerade. Suspicion no longer moved in whispers. It stood openly in the street, casting its shadow upon every neighbor. What had begun as gossip had hardened into fear. Everyone believed the inspector was close to an arrest, but no one knew whose name would be spoken. Inspector Cray himself was restless. He sensed the village had reached its breaking point, and he feared that a misstep might lead to panic. Though his evidence was stronger than before, it was still incomplete. The sedative bottle might have been placed in the shed by any number of hands. Anonymous letters could be written by anyone with a pen. He had pursued Larton, Millicent, and Mrs. Sedgwick each in turn, yet none could be fixed with guilt beyond question. He knew he must act soon, but he lacked the decisive piece to tie the threads together. Miss Marple, on the other hand, was ready. For days she had been quietly assembling her own conclusions, each observation placed with care like a stitch in her knitting. She knew that timing mattered as much as evidence. To wait too long risked allowing the guilty to conceal their trail. To speak too soon risked giving them a chance to deny. And so she had resolved upon a gathering, one that would draw the circle close, where the guilty could no longer hide behind rumors and conjecture. The occasion was arranged at the vicarage with the cooperation of Mr. and Mrs. Clement, who were only too willing to assist. Invitations, this time genuine, were delivered to those most closely involved. Inspector Cray attended, eager for any development that might bring the case to conclusion. Larton arrived stiffly, determined to defend himself. Mrs. Sedgwick appeared pale and anxious, her eyes darting about the room. Millicent Bantry, clutching her mother's hand, came reluctantly, her youth and fear still plain. Colonel Bantry sat with stern composure, though his glance betrayed his concern for his daughter. Others of note filled the circle, their faces drawn and expectant. Miss Marple, seated in her usual unassuming chair, appeared the least remarkable of all. Her knitting rested in her lap, her pale eyes mild behind spectacles. Yet when she spoke, her voice, though soft, carried clearly through the room. "We have all been troubled," she began gently, "by the mystery surrounding poor Sir Geoffrey's death. Inspector Cray has pursued his inquiries with diligence, but perhaps it is now time to consider the matter not in terms of rumor or conjecture, but in terms of human nature." The inspector shifted, skeptical yet willing to listen. Miss Marple continued with calm assurance. She spoke first of the masquerade itself. It was, I think, the most curious element of all. Sir Geoffrey was not a man for frivolities. He had never sponsored such an event before, nor shown the least inclination for gaiety. And yet invitations went out in his name. They bore his signature, but not in his hand. Sir Geoffrey was meticulous, his writing never smudged. The blurred signature upon that card was not his. A murmur ran through the room, but Miss Marple pressed on. She spoke then of the sedative. "The doctor has told us that the amount was small, not enough to kill by itself, but enough to weaken a man under strain. Sir Geoffrey had enemies, both abroad and here at home. He had received anonymous letters, filled with threats and accusations. Those letters were not from strangers. Strangers do not know where a man hides his secrets. They were from someone to someone who knew Sir Geoffrey's habits, his routines, his character, and someone who wished to frighten him, perhaps to control him, perhaps to silence him." Her gaze drifted to the faces before her, resting briefly on each. "It is natural," she said, "that suspicion should fall upon Mr. Larton, who quarrelled with Sir Geoffrey, or upon young Millicent, who gave him the drink. But quarrels in public are not the same as murder, and youthful attempts at kindness are not crimes. No, the truth lies deeper, with those who understood Sir Geoffrey well enough to mimic his hand, to use his name, to manipulate the village into believing the masquerade was his idea." The silence in the room grew heavy. Mrs. Sedgwick shifted uneasily in her chair, her hands clasped tightly. Larton flushed, ready to protest, but Miss Marple raised her voice slightly, calm and steady. "There is arrogance in such an act, but also fear. To hide behind a masquerade, to orchestrate confusion with masks and costumes, is to believe one can control what others see. But human nature cannot be masked so easily. It reveals itself in small ways, in the eagerness to divert suspicion, in the trembling hand that betrays knowledge, in the insistence upon secrets where there should be none. Inspector Cray leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He sensed that Miss Marple was nearing the heart of the matter. Yet she did not speak the final word. Instead, she paused, allowing the silence to stretch until it seemed the room itself might burst. Then, with a gentle nod, she concluded, "And so we see that the masquerade was not only an evening of costumes and gaiety. It was a stage, set deliberately, upon which a final act of vengeance was played. The question that remains, of course, is who among us was the author of that play? For I believe we are very near to knowing." The room shifted uneasily. Mrs. Bantry clasped Millicent's hand tightly. Larton cleared his throat, his protest dying before it began. Mrs. Sedgwick's eyes flickered with panic, then quickly lowered. The inspector's pencil hovered above his notebook, and Miss Marple, serene in her chair, let the silence speak for her. She had drawn the circle close. Now she knew the guilty would betray themselves. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, its sound drifting into the vicarage as though marking a turning point. The storm of suspicion had gathered long enough. The truth, Miss Marple reflected, would soon step forward of its own accord. The hush in the vicarage drawing-room lingered after Miss Marple's gentle words, and it seemed to press upon the assembled company with almost physical weight. The inspector sat forward, pencil poised, his eyes fixed on the elderly spinster who appeared so mild and unassuming in her chair. The others shifted uneasily, each sensing that the circle had grown too tight to escape. Miss Marple, her knitting resting in her lap, looked serenely from one face to another before she spoke again. "It is often thought," she began softly, "that murders are the work of grand passions, love turned to jealousy, greed turned to violence. And yet, more often than not, they arise from something quieter, resentment, festering over years, hidden beneath the surface until the smallest spark brings it forth. Poor Sir Geoffrey had a life filled with such sparks, and though many here had reason to dislike him, only one arranged matters so elaborately." Her eyes, calm yet piercing, rested upon Mrs. Sedgwick. The housekeeper started as though struck, her lips parting soundlessly. Colonel Bantry gave a sharp intake of breath, while Millicent looked up in surprise. Mr. Larton frowned, half in relief, half in confusion. The inspector's pencil scratched across his page, and he nodded for Miss Marple to continue. "You see," Miss Marple went on, "it was Mrs. Sedgwick who was closest to Sir Geoffrey's habits. She alone would have known how particular he was with his signature, how impossible it would be for him to produce a blurred line. She alone was present to burn the anonymous letters, yet somehow always knew their contents. And she alone had access to his study, where the invitations were stored before being posted from Market Basing. The masquerade was not Sir Geoffrey's idea at all. It was hers. She sought to cloak the deed in confusion, hiding her actions behind masks and music. Mrs. Sedgwick gave a strangled protest, but her voice trembled. "I had no reason at all," she stammered. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "On the contrary, you had every reason. Sir Geoffrey had promised you a bequest, had he not? And yet he delayed altering his will. You feared he would change his mind, perhaps even cut you out altogether. The letters, I believe, were written to frighten him into dependence, to weaken his authority. But when they failed to achieve the desired effect, you resolved upon a more final course." The inspector glanced up sharply. "The sedative?" he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, Inspector. It was Mrs. Sedgwick who fetched tonics for the household, who would have the opportunity to obtain what she needed. A small dose, slipped into the glass of punch pressed upon Sir Geoffrey near the close of the evening, would weaken him at the precise moment you intended. His collapse in the alcove beneath the portrait seemed natural enough until the card was found beside him." She paused, her eyes steady on the trembling housekeeper. "That card, Mrs. Sedgwick, was your mistake. It was too deliberate, too staged. In trying to reinforce the illusion that Sir Geoffrey himself had sponsored the masquerade, you placed a forgery at his side. But you pressed the ink too soon, and the blur betrayed you. You wished us to believe that the evening was his design, when in fact it was yours, and in doing so, you left behind the very clue that condemned you. A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Bantry gasped audibly, while Millicent clutched her mother's hand. Larton shifted uncomfortably, though a flicker of relief passed across his face. The inspector's expression hardened, and he looked to Mrs. Sedgwick with renewed scrutiny. "What do you have to say?" he demanded. For a moment, Mrs. Sedgwick sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Then, with a sudden outburst, she cried, "He owed me! After all those years of service, he owed me. I ran that house. I bore his tempers. I endured his scorn. He promised I would be cared for. And then I heard him muttering about changes to his will. He would have left me with nothing." Her voice cracked, and she covered her face with trembling hands. "I only meant to frighten him, but he would not be frightened. He sneered at me. Always sneered. I could not bear it." The inspector rose at once, signaling the constable to step forward. Mrs. Sedgwick did not resist, her shoulders slumped, her defiance broken. The room remained hushed, every listener struck by the starkness of her confession. Colonel Bantry shifted uncomfortably, Mrs. Bantry dabbed at her eyes, and Millicent clung to her mother, pale with shock. The drama of the masquerade, once wrapped in masks and festivity, now lay revealed in the plain bitterness of human resentment. Miss Marple, calm as ever, folded her knitting neatly. "It is a sad thing," she said softly, "how resentment can fester when unacknowledged. Poor Sir Geoffrey was not a kind man, but unkindness does not merit such an end." Yet to Mrs. Sedgwick it seemed a lifetime of slights, and so she sought to redress them. It is often the way, I fear. Murder, in the end, is less a matter of opportunity than of character. The inspector, though respectful, could not help but regard Miss Marple with something like awe. "You have given me the case entirely," he said quietly. "I might have chased quarrels and disputes for weeks without seeing the truth." "And you," he broke off, shaking his head. Miss Marple only smiled gently. "It is not so difficult, Inspector. One has only to watch closely and to remember that human nature is much the same in every place, whether in a great city or a small village." The room slowly emptied, each guest subdued by what had been revealed. Colonel Bantry escorted his family home, determined to shield Millicent from further suspicion. Larton departed stiffly, his name at last eased of public blame, and Mrs. Sedgwick, once the quiet presence at Pritchard Lodge, was led away by the constable. Her future, as bleak as her past, had been servile. The masquerade's final mask had slipped, and beneath it lay nothing more than resentment and greed. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her eyes resting on the fire. She reflected on the truth she had uncovered, on the threads of deception, and on the fragility of human pride. Then, with a quiet sigh, she gathered her knitting and prepared to leave. There would be an aftermath, of course. There always was. But for now, the masquerade had played its last note, and the truth had spoken for itself. In the days that followed the revelation at the vicarage, St. Mary Mead settled into a strange quiet. The gossip that had once churned endlessly now carried a different tone, softer, tinged with unease. The villagers were not accustomed to such proximity to murder, and though they had speculated with enthusiasm when suspicion fell upon others, they now spoke with lowered voices, as if the truth itself might overhear. The masquerade, once anticipated with such excitement, was mentioned only reluctantly, as though to recall it was to summon the shadow of Sir Geoffrey's lifeless form beneath the portrait. Mrs. Sedgwick's arrest had been the final jolt that shattered the familiar fabric of village life. Many had known her as a dependable housekeeper, a figure of constancy in Sir Geoffrey's household. To discover that she had orchestrated deception, written anonymous letters, and slipped sedatives into a glass was unsettling in a way that no gossip had prepared them for. At the Blue Boar, patrons spoke of her with disbelief. "She poured my tea only last week," one villager said. Always so polite. Who could have guessed? The words, repeated in countless variations, revealed the deeper truth that no one wished to believe the person they had passed daily in the street could harbor such bitterness. Inspector Cray remained in the village for several days to conclude his work, but his role had been reduced. It was Miss Marple's quiet observations that had untangled the threads, and though he did not say so openly, his acknowledgment was plain in the deferential manner with which he spoke to her. When he departed, he left behind an impression of brisk efficiency, but it was the old lady at her cottage window who had solved the puzzle. Few said it aloud, but all knew it. Life began, slowly, to return to routine. The postmistress once again fussed over misplaced parcels, the vicar's wife organized her next committee meeting, and children played in the lanes with nervous glances now fading from their eyes. Yet beneath the surface, the masquerade lingered. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it would be decades before such frivolities were attempted again, and Mrs. Clement admitted she could not hear music without recalling that dreadful moment when the quartet stopped mid-note. The village carried the memory like a scar, faint but lasting. Millicent Bantry, freed at last from suspicion, regained her spirits gradually. The relief of her innocence being known was tempered by the ordeal she had endured. Her laughter returned, though softer than before, touched by a new awareness of how quickly joy could be twisted into fear. Colonel Bantry was steadfast in protecting her, and Mrs. Bantry took every opportunity to praise Miss Marple's wisdom, though in the same breath she embellished details for dramatic retelling. Jane sat there, calm as anything. She told half the village, and simply pointed out what none of us could see. Extraordinary, really. The tale grew with each telling, but the essence was true enough. For Miss Marple, the conclusion brought no triumph, only quiet reflection. She tended her garden, visited her neighbors, and sat by her fire in the evenings with her knitting. Yet her thoughts lingered on Mrs. Sedgwick. It was easy enough to say she had been driven by greed or resentment, but Miss Marple knew such motives rarely sprang up overnight. They grew slowly, watered by slights and disappointments, until at last they overwhelmed judgment. Sir Geoffrey, for all his authority, had been blind to the bitterness he fostered in those about him. His arrogance had left space for resentment to take root, and in the end, it was that blindness which had led to his downfall. On a quiet afternoon, Miss Marple confided some of her thoughts to Dr. Haydock, who had come to check on her roses. "It is a sad business," she said, her voice gentle. "So many people imagine that evil arrives in great storms, but more often it is like ivy, creeping along a wall slow, silent, and unnoticed until it has weakened the foundation." The doctor nodded, though his eyes betrayed his discomfort. "You see too much, Miss Marple," he replied. "The rest of us prefer to look away." She smiled faintly, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. It was not in her nature to look away. The village, for all its unease, could not resist its inclination toward gossip, and soon other matters began to occupy attention. A dispute over the churchyard roses, a rumor of new tenants at the old mill house, and the prospect of a Christmas pageant all began to restore the rhythm of ordinary life. Yet whenever the masquerade was mentioned, voices dropped and eyes grew wary. The blurred signature, the poisoned glass, the unmasking of the housekeeper, all had become part of the lore of St. Mary Mead, to be recalled in future years with a shiver. One evening, as the autumn wind rattled the shutters and the fire glowed warmly in her cottage, Miss Marple sat reflecting on the affair. She thought of the masks, the music, and the blurred signature that had seemed so trivial to others, but had pointed so clearly to forgery. She thought of the villagers, each so ready to believe in the guilt of their neighbor, each missing the quiet truth. And she thought of Mrs. Sedgwick, who had served faithfully for years, yet allowed resentment to consume her. Human nature, Miss Marple murmured to herself, is the same everywhere. Whether in a palace or a cottage, pride and bitterness do their work. One must be watchful. She set aside her knitting and looked out the window into the darkened lane. All was quiet now, the village at rest. The masquerade was over, the masks discarded. But the lesson remained. For beneath every pleasant surface, she knew, there lurked the complexity of human hearts capable of kindness, but just as capable of cruelty. And it was that knowledge, quietly born, that made her the keenest observer of them all. With that thought, Miss Marple closed her curtains, stirred the fire, and returned to her chair. Life in St. Mary Mead would go on, as it always did. Yet the memory of the masquerade, with its missing signature and fatal glass, would never entirely fade. It would remain as a quiet reminder of the truths that lay beneath the calmest of surfaces, truths that only the sharp eyes of an elderly lady had been able to see.